Go on to Genesis 18, where things become very interesting. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw three men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the trees." So he says, "My Lord." He recognizes them as Yahweh. It's fascinating that Yahweh appears in the guise of, say, three angels, or I guess they're not described as angels, specifically described as three men. "Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourself, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cake." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself. There's again the laugh, Isaac, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" I think the King James, it says anything too difficult for the Lord, but it's the same general sense. "At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh." For she was afraid. He said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." Then the men set out from there, and they looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way.
I guess spoiler alert, but if you decipher this scene, effectively it's describing Yahweh sleeping with Sarah in Abraham's tent and giving him Isaac. That's the reading that we give to this scene. And the clues are in the Hebrew, but they're also in the staging of the scene as well. The Hebrew suggests proximity between Yahweh and Sarah. So he's behind Yahweh, it would seem, exiting the tent. And the prediction is being made that he'll return, like they'll return in a year and they'll have a child, right? Because nothing's so hard for Yahweh. And there are other things too that are suggestive, that are more obscure, but seem to be making the point as well. And this is feasting, right? Because ultimately what we see here is the first appearance of the tent of feasts, which will be a tent of meetings. This will be a tent that Yahweh inhabits during Exodus, during the wandering of the Israelites. He'll be in this tent where he's worshipped and he's given offerings. And there's a bunch of metaphor around here where he's a fire god. And again, things that we've discussed in earlier calls where there's a sexual connotation essentially to the sacrifice, especially in the Hebrew. The fire is described as consuming. It's the same verb as eating, like you would eat something. You would eat a lamb or food offered by Abraham to Yahweh. It's the same verb, to consume or to eat. So the fire is eating. So there's a kind of consumption motif where there's a sexual connotation to eating, right? Where you're consuming someone sexually, essentially.
What is that word in Hebrew, Mark?
Oh, okay. Akal is the word, right? So this is the common word used to describe eating, but it also describes Yahweh as a consuming or eating fire. So the fire eats, that's the metaphor, right? As opposed to burn, it consumes, it eats, it devours. I think that the stronger proofs come elsewhere, and they ultimately come in the Hebrew. But there is a kind of suggestiveness to the scene, as people on the call will realize, if you were paying, close attention to the scene, what actually is going on in the scene. Yahweh, who is depicted as a human or as three people, is personified. Why is he predicting after this visit with Sarah that she will have a child in a year? Why is he making that prediction? And what is this? Why is she laughing? Why is this laughter, this kind of suggestive flirtation going on toward the end of the scene? And again, ultimately, the Hebrew becomes more revealing. Richard, you were about to say something there?
Well, yeah, I just think it's worth rereading this because there are a lot of things that are ambiguous. So we are saying, and this was sort of a mind-blowing reading when Mark first suggested it to me, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're reading way too much in it. And then I looked at this passage with clear eyes, and it's right there. So he looked up, and that is Abraham looked up and saw three men standing near him. Where is Yahweh here? Are the three men Yahweh? I think that is what is being suggested, but it is fairly ambiguous. But then you have Yahweh as a person appearing to him. So Abram went and he's preparing this wonderful feast because, God himself is paying him a visit. They said to him, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" So it's an interesting sort of suggestion. Again, this is all coming after we know how Abram treated Sarai when they were in Egypt. So it's not, again, there's already a sort of suggestion of sexual excess with where is your wife? And he said, there in the tent. Then one said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife, Sarah, shall have a son. So he's been promising Abram for quite some time that he will be the father of all nations. But now it's a more direct, immediate promise of she's going to have a son when I return to you, i.e. in 9 months. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now, Abram and Sarah were old and advanced in age, and had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of woman. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I've grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? So now we have the Lord, that is Yahweh, said to Abram, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season. Again, i.e. in 9 months, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid, he said. He said, oh yes, you did laugh. Here, laughter, and it's two things, in fact. It's laughter of the orgasm. Sexual enjoyment is indistinguishable from laughter. You're sort of losing yourself, as it were. I think there's also a suggestion, and again, I'm drawing this from Mark, of course, but I fully confirm it. There's also a suggestion of laughing at Abraham. He's the one being cucked. I mean, he's getting cucked by God. So, if you put it that way, maybe it's not too embarrassing, but he's being cucked nonetheless. And so there are a couple of key things. First off, in our reading, Isaac is the son of God, much like Jesus. He's the son of God. He is Yahweh's child. There's this woman who's probably still beautiful, although of advanced age, but she's still got a few eggs left, I guess, when Yahweh is in bed with her. He's so powerful that he can make an older woman pregnant. Who is Abraham? He is the Cuck of all nations. So it's a new formulation of who Abraham really is. He's not the father of all nations. He's the Cuck of all nations. I'll read from the book. The first appearance of a tent of meeting occurs earlier than Exodus. In fact, it is a feature of Yahweh's blessing, quote unquote, of Abraham as the forefather of Israel and ultimately all Christians and Muslims. In Genesis 17, Yahweh completes his covenant with Abram, renaming him Abraham to signify the transformation. Yahweh declares that Abraham, at the ripe age of 99, will become a father of many nations. That is Ab Haman Goyim. The Ab Haman ostensibly forms the basis of his new name and thus establishes the Abrahamic religions, whereby Yahwehism will envelop billions of people and cultures across the planet. Yahweh also promises the land of Canaan to Abraham as his everlasting possession. This covenant occurs through Abraham's circumcision, Brit Milah, of himself and his entire household. This should be understood as a symbolic act of emasculation, if also self-enslavement. Before circumcision became a rite in Judaism, it was the mark of a slave. This likely would have been recognized by the early audiences of the Bible. Yahweh also informs Abraham that his wife, Sarai, aged 90, will now be known as Sarah, and she too will bear a son. You are to name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. 17:19. Abraham is shocked and incredulous at the notion that the pair could produce a child at such an advanced age. Additionally, Abraham already has a son, Ishmael, who is the offspring of one of his slave women, Hagar. Ishmael, too, Yahweh confirms, will be blessed, but it is Isaac with whom the covenant will be bound. Why is this? On one hand, the preference for Isaac over Ishmael reiterates the firstborn motif, which the younger son overcomes the elder. With Jacob and Esau, the latter will be identified as Aryan. Ishmael will be understood as the ancestor of the Arab tribes and a kind of prophet and patriarch of Islam. The Muslims are, as it were, blessed but not chosen. Isaac's conflict with Ishmael plays out to this very day. Two Abrahamic peoples forever at loggerheads. But there is another reason why Yahweh forms a covenant with Isaac alone. The Bible informs us that Isaac is truly Yahweh's offspring, not Abraham's. This remarkable and at first glance outrageous conclusion is borne out in clues in Genesis 18. Here Yahweh will visit Abraham at the entrance of his tent, where he awaits the deity with his wife. Interestingly, Yahweh appears to Abraham in the form of three men. Receiving the God, Abraham says, "Let a little water be brought that you may wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a bit of bread so that you may refresh yourself. This is why you have passed your servant's way." Abraham will also provide a feast to the Jewish God in the form of curds, milk, and a calf. Here the washing of feet, as it is with Jesus and the prostitute Mary Magdalene, John 12, as well of Boaz and Ruth, Ruth 3, is highly suggestive. It is a sexual innuendo, as is feasting, which Yahweh will also partake in. This becomes relevant to the Ohel Moed, or tent of meeting, which also may mean tent of feast, Moed. Ultimately, it is a tent of sex, and Sarah is the feast in question. As mentioned, Sarah was not always named Sarah. Before Abraham agreed to his circumcision and covenant with Yahweh, his wife's name was Sarai, which is suggested by scholars as meaning princess. It is only during the sequence in which Abraham submits himself to Yahweh that his wife becomes Sarah. This latter name, the feminine of Sar, also means princess or noblewoman. So why did Yahweh bother giving her a new moniker, which seems to mean the same as the old one? Following the conventions of Hebrew, the name Sarai more accurately translates as the plural of prince and might find a better translation as nobility. Hence, the renaming may suggest that the Aryan princess, Sarah, is being separated from her class, Sarai. The new name Sarah, meaning princess, may also play on Sirah, meaning a sacrificial she-goat, or on Siora, meaning barley. In other words, Sarai is being designated Sarah to indicate her as an offering. Both words, Sarai and Siora, appear in the Hebrew Bible to describe sacrifices to Yahweh. Yahweh's cuckolding of Abraham is made even clearer, ever clearer, as the parable continues. As Abraham watches the men eat under the tree, they ask Abraham, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" Abraham's answer, "In the tent." The word used here for wife or woman is the common one, Ishala Ishe, which again may also mean burnt offering. And to be sure, Sarah is in the process of being consumed by the fire god. Here it is important to note that the number of men speaking to Abraham is not specified, as it is in the opening passage of Genesis 18. This is because Yahweh is not among them. Rather, having bedded Sarah, he is just emerging from the tent. Hence, the question is fraught with innuendo. In the line that directly follows, Yahweh immediately responds, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." The narration then reports, "And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him." That is Yahweh. This suggests Yahweh exiting the tent with Sarah, following close behind. Again, Sarah will laugh quietly to herself, considering it absurd that she would bear children at the age of 90. Yahweh hears her giggling, again suggesting physical proximity. Then Yahweh asks why she laughs, boasting, "Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah denies having laughed, yet Yahweh assures her that she did. There's an odd tone of flirtation here. More significantly, there is wordplay. The root word for laugh appearing here is tazak. In its 13 occurrences in the Hebrew Bible, it is frequently translated as laughing and mocking, but also as caressing. The name Isaac, or Yitzhak, means he laughs. His name is directly derived from the word tzachak. When Isaac's birth is narrated in Genesis, the cuckolding theme continues. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Then Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears of this will laugh with me. Sarah is evidently teasing, if not humiliating, her husband. Laugh takes on a double meaning. First, it is the caress or even orgasm she experienced in the arms of Yahweh. Secondly, it is the mockery that Abraham will be subjected to in the aftermath of the affair. There is indeed nothing too difficult for the Lord.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's basically it. I consider this more of a kind of discovery than speculation, to be honest with you.
I agree.
Yeah. So that's what's going on in Genesis 18. Yahweh got in the tent and screwed Sarah, right? And is the real father of Isaac. But all of this is concealed, of course. So it is esoteric in the truest sense of that word. People have been reading this Bible for thousands of years and they've missed this. It's clear to say that it's been concealed effectively. So I think that this is something that's understood by Jews that have a kind of true understanding of the Hebrew Bible. Something like this would be understood, right? So and these are some of the reasons that we describe Judaism as a bride gathering cult. Because here, and again, not only is Abram indicated as noble, as this high father, so also is Sarah indicated as noble, Aryan, in other words, princess. She's a princess. They're both of this kind of high class, despite the sort of wayward direction they've followed under the influence of Yahweh, where they've become travelers and Sarah has become promiscuous and so forth, right? It's suggested from their names that they originate ultimately from a kind of nobility. But Yahweh is something distinct. He's this sort of third party that comes in and gains access to Sarah through this covenant, ultimately through this covenant and symbolic emasculation of Abraham. So Abraham has been emasculated. And that's the significance of the circumcision. And Genesis 18 just drives the point home. As Esau will lose his rights as firstborn to Jacob, something similar, very similar will happen to Abraham. He'll be cuckolded by Yahweh. And Isaac, the son that has the covenant with him, is actually Yahweh's son. But what's being described here also, too, is a kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of game plan. It's a kind of it's an evolutionary strategy where I think that I posit and I argue that they see themselves as kind of tied to us as we represent a kind of genetic resource, right? Again, this metaphor of the feast, for example, becomes useful in understanding this. We're seen as a kind of resource or fuel for the fire god, this passionate fire god that is Yahweh. Therefore, it is a bride gathering cult. We could say, well, we're reaching. I mean, I don't think that we're reaching at all with this analysis of Genesis 18. I think it's 100% on point. But you could argue, and people will argue, though I think that the evidence is too abundant. But the argument is that it's a bride gathering cult. And one of the ways that we verify this is that we see it in the esoteric language of their art and their religion, from the Hebrew Bible to Hollywood films and so forth, that there's this esoteric mating song, you might even call it, which I think is actually a good way of describing it, where it's showing a kind of sexual victory over an Aryan or Gentile competitor. But we can also corroborate this through the genetics of Jews themselves. The Ashkenazi Jews are 50 or 40%, but the descent is all from Gentile women, or primarily from Gentile women. Therefore, genetically, that's what they represent. They represent a bride gathering cult. They're coming into lands and taking the desired brides. And how are they doing this? They're doing it through competing successfully with the natives, through the accumulation of resource and wealth in particular, right? And that gives you access to the desired brides and so forth. And therefore, Jewish become to some extent a form of auxiliary woman, right? They almost like these sort of camp followers. If you imagine Jews as like Vikings, are plundering a land or invading a land, this is what Vikings would do, right? They would come in and sleep with all the women and take the women as their wives, and then the children would be they would be Celtic and Viking or whatever the case may be. So it's something similar to that. But of course, Jews are not a martial people solely. I mean, I think it's unfair to say that they're incapable of being martial. Of course, we see that in Israel, for example. So the technique for sexual competition and conquest is different. It becomes economic, cultural, religious. This is the form of competition. This is the technique that they've developed, REM, GEM in their case, Jewish Esoteric Moralization. This is how we describe this form of, again, ultimately, it's a kind of mating call. It's the mating call of the Jews. And it's through their art that they are delivering this mating song. And we can argue as well that this ultimately is the point or the purpose of art and religion, is to develop a mating song. And so, but this Genesis 18 gives us ultimately the meaning of the tent of meeting, right? So now we have the meaning of it. If we're able to decipher what's going on in that parable, then when the tent of meeting appears later in the Israelite camp, where Yahweh is ensconced, invisible in this tent, and he's being offered sacrifices in the tent that he's burning, right? And we know the metaphor going on there. This tent is a reference to his meeting with Sarah, where he's impregnating Sarah, right? So there you go. It solves the whole Hebrew Bible. It solves all the kind of symbolism in it. The Hebrew Bible is written in such a clever way.
Yeah, just to like hammer it home, what the tent of meeting is, whether it's an actual tent, tabernacle, whether it's a Hollywood studio with a couch, whether it's a church where sexual excess is clearly present, if not, certainly not the primary focus, as it was with the tabernacle. This is what it's about. The man behind the curtain gets to feast on women.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's, and the thing too is that, like, it's hard to even really be mad. It's just so interesting, right? The behavior of Jews is so interesting and alien and bizarre through their religion, but it's also so kind of genius on a level, and clever, and also so like fastidious in a way. And I think this is something that we have to learn from Jews, is that they take such care in developing their symbolism in their art and their parable and so forth. And you have to assume that a part of this is just because of the pressures that the sort of evolutionary pressures that they faced, is that they really had to develop a kind of secret language, ultimately a language of symbols. Also Hebrew, as we see, it serves as a kind of cipher key as well, right? So it's just a remarkable thing. And I think the best case scenario would be that we would find a way to kind of like, wean Jews themselves off this religion, because I think some number of them, of course, are Sussman, and it's probably the vast majority. And maybe it's too idealistic and optimistic, but I think that, ultimately, of course, our approach is cultural and religious and peaceful, and we hope for peaceful outcomes and so forth. But I think that there is something very remarkable about these people, and there is a kind of genius there that has to be acknowledged. In the book, we acknowledge that if we consider ourselves collectively, or at least the best element of us, to be Apollo, then they certainly deserve the title Mercury, and also Bacchus. So there's a kind of genius there that you have to acknowledge. We may not follow Mercury, as the psychopomp into the underworld. We may not follow Bacchus as this god of madness and decadence, but we recognize and we have respect for this sort of talent or the ability or the genius there, because I think also that we can learn a great deal from them, but we have to learn it.
What, you want to become the man behind the curtain, Mark? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that. No, that's something, Richard. That's something you would find more appealing.
Yeah, I would enjoy that more. Yes,
I'm too much of a shucks naive like country boy.
But
anyway.
Just to go back to what I was saying before. So we'll get in 2 weeks. We'll get to the sacrifice of Isaac, and many Christians say that they would say that the sacrifice of Isaac kind of like foresees Jesus and so on. Clearly, the notion of Jesus as sacrifice is referencing this very famous passage in Genesis. But that connection takes on a whole new meaning when you recognize that Isaac is also the son of God, quite literally. The whole New Testament, that notion of a son of God, takes on new meaning once you are able to see this passage correctly.
The other thing it does too is that it's kind of, Genesis 18 is probably one of the most sort of interesting examples of this motif, but it does just basically kind of establish a trope where whenever you have like Yahweh visiting a woman who can't have a baby and then she's hit, or and probably more commonly, angels visiting women that thought that they were not going to be able to have children. So in the New Testament, this would be Elizabeth and Mary, right, who were visited by angels.
Right.
There's something suggestive going on here. It's not so when someone visits.
Exactly.
Yeah, it happens with Elisha and Elijah, where they're visiting widows. And so whether it's a prophet or an angel or Yahweh himself, they visit a woman and they say, "Hey, you know what? I think in a year you're going to have a kid. Don't 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 ask me how I know that." There's an innuendo going on there. This visitation is sexual in nature. And of course, among the Greeks, it becomes more explicit. The Greeks don't conceal the fact that Zeus is descended down and impregnated with a mortal woman, a nymph, or another goddess, or whatever the case may be. It's unconcealed. That trope is unconcealed in the Greco-Roman pantheon. But it becomes innuendo, and it becomes concealed, and it becomes esoteric in Judaism and Christianity, which, again, is one of the reasons that we look at this stuff and we're like, wow, this is, on some level, it's kind of cool that they've encoded this, they've created this sort of cipher.